So, at New Environments, we work with a wide range of projects that they span from larger scale, long-term strategic visions down to public space and landscape plans. And we do that by embracing the complexity of the urban system and then applying a holistic approach, which means, for instance, we take a topic like mobility, which is very important in our work, and we link it to all the other challenges and stakeholders that play a role and coexist in the city. So today, despite the fact we are at the Cargo Bike Festival, I'm not going to talk about cargo bikes, at least not directly, but I'm going to talk about the way we use the street and the way we can design better streets. And that involves also cargo bikes, because they are a means to achieve a more sustainable, a safer, and more attractive urban environment. And I believe they also have potential to grow in the future as one of the key players on our streets. So the project I'm presenting today is called Riders on the Street, and it's about the integration of last mile logistics with street design. I developed this project with the Urban Dynamics, our design collaborators, and the partnership with the Amsterdam, Eindhoven, and Leiden municipality, as well as psychologistic companies. So, what we believe is that last mile logistics should be part of street design. And why? As you can see from the top row, last mile logistics delivery is not a new phenomenon in cities. Since we have commerce, exchange of goods, there is cargo being delivered and exchanged. Even cargo bikes are not a new invention. But what's happening today is that we are digitalizing our economy. So there is an enormous growth of the e-commerce, and that drives a lot of growth also in the sector of last mile logistics. But also we see that our cities are growing more and more compact, and we are trying to mix more and more functions and retain also productive functions together with living and working and commerce in city centers. Therefore, all this incentivated the growth of the sector of last mile logistics. But as well, we have stricter regulations, for example, the zero emission zones in city centers. And that is boosting innovation. So we see a lot of companies and solutions that have been deployed, like we see today in this festival. So I believe that from the regulatory perspective, as Karen mentioned earlier, there is still a bit of a Wild West, like a chaotic situation. Regulators are trying to catch up with the innovation and the pace of this sector growing. But also I believe that from a design perspective, there is quite a gap that we need to fill. I like to show this image because it shows that actually our streets are a very limited space, and there's a lot of activities going on there. When you imagine a street as a space for moving, so for transport, for biking, for walking, but it's also a social space for meeting, for playing, an economic space, for shopping, for instance. And on the top of that, today streets are more and more important as ecological spaces, or spaces that address climate resiliency, water retention, for instance. If on the top of that you add the demands, the growing demands of this sector of last mile logistics, then you see the conundrum. We have a very narrow space, and we need to organize a lot of requirements for different players and different functions in it. So nothing can be solved only on the public space. That's why in the sections that we show, we always include also the interior of the buildings. So what's happening at the ground floor, not just what's happening on the public space, because some solutions need to be addressed in the private space inside the buildings, for instance. That's an example. If you look at the very simple schemes of how we deliver goods, a vehicle parks in the street and an operator goes up to a floor, for example, of a high-rise building, which takes quite some time, 10, 15 minutes to deliver parcels in the building. And all this time, the vehicle is being parked in the street, occupying precious space that could be dedicated to other uses. While optimizing, for example, a small solution in a building, for example, a central pickup point like a parcel locker in the lobby of a building, we can drastically reduce the waiting time, the loading and unloading time of the vehicle parked on the street. So that's just a small example. And another key finding of our study is that actually downsizing is very crucial when you talk about dense city centers. Downsizing of vehicles. You know that vans are very inefficient when you enter a dense urban areas. Often we see vans running around half empty, and they make a less direct route to deliver goods. While cargo bike, for example, is an excellent means of transportation because it's very direct, has shorter trips, fully loaded with cargo. So we have a choice there. But in order to undertake choices on what kind of vehicles we want to use in the city, we also need to zoom out and look at the network level. In order to keep a cargo bike efficient, for example, which is a radius of around 5 kilometers, we need to take choices at the network level. Where do we locate hubs, logistic hubs? For example, you can see in the right example, there is a hybrid organization in a neighborhood where you have one logistic hub and smaller micro hubs that allow a cargo bike to run into this network, pick up goods and stop several times. That makes the range of the bike very efficient, more than a van. But what we're really interested in, besides all the solutions that you can find at the network level, at the city scale, we really zoom in this study at the space on the street. So every different vehicle occupies and uses the street in a different way. From a robot that can use the sidewalk for the last meters of the delivery, to a cargo bike that goes on the cycle lanes, and vans and other vehicles that use the road. And every vehicle also has a different size for parking, occupies a different space. So in order to tackle real case scenarios, what we did was to develop a methodology to actually correctly estimate the impact of last mile delivery and urban logistics on public space. Briefly, what we do is to translate the program that normally is given from a certain urban area in square meters into actual units, which means actual addresses where you're going to deliver goods. And only that, then we can estimate the number of journeys and what the flow of logistics will be. Then we can start taking choices about which vehicles are going to be employed for each logistic flow. And even more important is the factor of time, which is quite crucial because in the very narrow spaces and very compact, dense urban areas, we have to think about way to share space and to use space at different times in different ways. So working with time windows, for instance. After we do all these steps, we can really quantify more correctly, properly, what is the impact of these logistic flows on public space and start to think about solutions, which can be also small-scale solutions, but have a great impact on the system. So yes, many of you are familiar with these scenes. These photos are taken in Dutch cities. For example, you see a cargo bike that in the last meters before delivering exits the cycle lane and goes on the sidewalk. Or a van that is parked on a sidewalk temporarily to deliver some goods. Or even a man pushing a trolley on a sidewalk again. A biker delivering food crossing a pedestrian square. Or also like a terrace of a cafe that is using a delivery area during outside of delivery times. So space is limited, we need to share it. So we try to represent with this kind of visualization the dynamic nature that streets should have and have today. This is, for example, one of our case studies in Eindhoven. It's a small commercial street, bustling street in the center of Eindhoven, Kleineberg, where there is a lot of cafes and shops. And you can see here, we try to plot on the same drawing different activities that happen at different times of the day, actually, to show really this dynamic and flexible use of space. For instance, cafe terraces are really used only when the cafe is open, but then they can become spaces for parking a bike or for shared mobility or for delivery. But also, some solutions cannot be found on the street itself, but maybe on an adjacent parking lot, you can consolidate a delivery point like a parcel locker or a small micro hub, and then you go pick up your parcel on foot for a few meters. So there is like the case of Eindhoven, which is really an old town center, already existing street. It helped us to understand really how we can use time in a smart way, managing the curb in a flexible way, using micro solutions to really optimize the use of the street and make it an attractive space during the rest of the day. Then I show you briefly the case of Amsterdam. We worked on a new development area, so it's still under development, it's not built yet, where the municipality has a very strong ambition of putting in a high density, high-rise residential neighborhood a lot of productive functions, the so-called maker spaces, which is a phenomenon we see a lot in European cities nowadays. Well, that's a beautiful thing to integrate work in residential area, but actually it also carries a lot of logistic demands, especially heavy vehicles, conflicting, of course, on the public space really with a lighter uses of space, whether it's biking or just kids going to school. Yeah, for this case, basically we started to face the choice how we can solve what we can solve in the public space and what actually has to be solved in the buildings or in the building blocks. As I mentioned before, a lobby of a residential building on the left in the image could be used, for example, could contain a locker or a concierge service which picks up, it's a centralized pickup point for parcels and minimizes the parking time of the cargo bike on the pavement. On the other end, we need to think about time windows for heavier trucks that deliver goods to the maker spaces. But for example, you can also think of freeing the street from parked trucks and heavier vehicles and solving that indoors in the buildings. We try to highlight these options because I think they're very important in the negotiation between the public sector and the private sector. This is about responsibility. So who is taking care of solving nuisance of logistics in the public space? Is going to be a duty of the municipality that does that in the public space, or is a duty of the developer that has to solve it on his own plot for the bigger neighborhood? So I think, you know, it's on one end you need to, if you have an ambition of having an attractive public space for people, then you need to take choices and negotiate with developers as a public sector to solve some of these tasks within the private area. So vice versa, if you want a program that is very mixed, that contains a lot of work functions, you can only support that with a certain type of public space design, or a certain public space can only support a certain amount of work functions. So just briefly, the conclusions of our studies, the most important points, I believe, are that when we talk about urban logistics, we need to adopt an integrated approach. We cannot think only about cargo bikes or about delivery of goods, but we need to include all urban logistics, all the activities that go on the street, including, for example, waste management, for instance. Sharing space, time for us is a crucial component that needs to be integrated in design. So we can design only thinking about one function that one space will have, but if we want to design shared spaces, flexible spaces, we need to integrate also the way they will be used in the day and during the week. And then this negotiation, public and private sector, is important. What's happening in the buildings, what's happening in the public space. Now we concluded the first phase of this research, and we are transitioning into a next phase, more applied. So we are developing really a design model, which we take as, let's say, a sample neighborhood that contains all the situation of building typologies, types of public spaces, and different densities. And then we attribute a different program to the areas, and with that we can obtain or showcase a set of solutions how to solve last mile logistics on the street. So if you want to know more about this, we can have a chat after the conference. But for now, it's all. Thank you.